Picture this. It's Christmas Eve, 1898, and your carriage is pulling up the long drive to the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island. You've been invited to spend the holiday with the Cornelius Vanderbilt II family, and as the mansion comes into view, you actually gasp. You've heard about the Breakers. Everyone has. It's been written about in newspapers, discussed in every drawing room in New York. But seeing it in person, especially decorated for Christmas, is something else entirely. The Italian Renaissance palazzo rising against the grey December sky. 70 rooms of Indiana limestone and marble, every window glowing with warm light, the ocean crashing dramatically on the cliffs behind it. This isn't just a house. This is a statement, a monument, possibly the most spectacular private residence in America. The front entrance is magnificent. Massive bronze and glass doors flanked by enormous wreaths of fresh evergreens and red velvet ribbons, the kind of wreaths that required a team of gardeners days to create. As the butler opens the door and you step inside, you're immediately enveloped in warmth and the scent of pine and cinnamon, and something wonderful cooking somewhere deep in the house. The great hall rises 45 feet above you, and you have to tilt your head back to take it all in. The ceiling is adorned with elaborate gilded plasterwork. Massive crystal chandeliers sparkle overhead. And there, dominating the space, is a Christmas tree that must be 30 feet tall. Decorated so elaborately, it looks like something from a European palace rather than someone's home. Fresh garlands are draped along the carved limestone balustrades. Massive arrangements of hothouse flowers. In December, roses and lilies and orchids that must have cost a fortune fill every alcove. Red velvet bows are tied to sconces and doorways. Every surface gleams. The marble floors are polished to mirror brightness. The gilded details catch candlelight and electric light. The Breakers has both, the ultimate in modern luxury, creating an effect that's almost overwhelming in its beauty and richness. This is what unlimited wealth looks like at Christmas. This is the kind of celebration most people only dream about. Mrs. Vanderbilt, Alice, your hostess, appears to greet you, elegant in a tea gown that probably cost more than a working family earns in a year. Her manner gracious and warm. "Welcome to the Breakers," she says, as if welcoming you to a cozy cottage, rather than to a 70-room Italian palazzo staffed by dozens of servants. "We're so delighted you could join us for Christmas. I do hope you'll be comfortable." Comfortable seems like an understatement. Your bedroom upstairs is larger than most people's entire homes, with its own fireplace and sitting area, and private bathroom with hot running water and heated towel racks. The other guests are gathering in the music room for tea before dinner. 15 or 20 people, all from the highest levels of New York society, all dressed beautifully, all clearly thrilled to be spending Christmas at the Breakers. You can hear the excited conversations, people discussing the decorations, admiring the house, complimenting Alice on her exquisite taste. This is the social event of the Newport Christmas season. Being invited here means you've made it, that you're part of the inner circle, that the Vanderbilts consider you worthy of their spectacular hospitality. You follow a footman, one of many. You've already seen at least a dozen different servants moving efficiently through the house, through a series of interconnected rooms, each more beautiful than the last. The morning room with its platinum leaf walls and views of the ocean. The library with its hand-carved Circassian walnut paneling and thousands of leather-bound books. The billiard room lined with Italian marble. Every room is decorated for Christmas, trees or elaborate arrangement, garlands, candles, evidence of meticulous planning and significant expense. 70 rooms. How do you even decorate 70 rooms for Christmas? How many servants does that require? How much does it cost? How long does it take? The Vanderbilt children appear briefly, the younger ones supervised by their governess, excited about Christmas but well-behaved, clearly accustomed to guests and formal occasions. They're beautiful children, perfectly dressed, living in this palace as though it's normal, as though every child has 30-foot Christmas trees, and receives gifts that cost more than most families earn in months. You wonder what Christmas must feel like for them. Is it magical? Or is it just expected? Do they appreciate this? Or is it impossible to appreciate what you've never been without? As tea is served, in Sèvres porcelain naturally, with silver service that's probably worth thousands, you settle into the music room with the other guests, everyone chattering excitedly about the house, the decorations, their own Christmas preparations, plans for the evening and tomorrow. The atmosphere is festive and warm and filled with anticipation. This is going to be a perfect Christmas. 2 days in the most beautiful house in America, with delicious food and elegant company and every comfort imaginable. You feel extraordinarily fortunate to be here, to experience this level of luxury and hospitality, to see how the wealthiest family in America celebrates the holiday. But as you sip your tea and admire the platinum-leafed ceiling, and listen to conversations about who's wearing what tomorrow and what entertainment has been planned, what you don't yet know is that Christmas in a 70-room mansion comes with some realities you haven't quite considered, some surprising aspects of celebrating in a house this enormous, with a family this wealthy, with expectations this high. Some ways that what looks like pure magic from the outside is more complicated when you're actually experiencing it. Some truths about the breakers at Christmas that will become very clear over the next 2 days as you live inside this spectacular, overwhelming, sometimes surprisingly strange holiday celebration. If you're watching with tired eyes and an overthinking mind, this story is for you. If you really enjoy these bedtime journeys through history, please like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love knowing where these stories are keeping you company. Let's talk about what Christmas at the Breakers was actually like, the reality of celebrating in a 70-room mansion, and the surprising truths about a holiday that looked like pure magic, but that came with complications nobody warned you about. The sheer scale of decorating the Breakers for Christmas was genuinely staggering, something you begin to understand as you're given a tour of the house before dinner. Alice Vanderbilt is proud of her home. She has every right to be. It's spectacular. And she enjoys showing guests the various rooms, explaining the architectural details, pointing out the imported materials and artistic touches that make the Breakers extraordinary. The great hall that first overwhelmed you when you entered is actually just the beginning. The house was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the most prestigious architect in America, completed in 1895 at a cost of approximately $7 million, equivalent to over $200 million today, not including the furnishings and art which added millions more. It's modeled on Italian Renaissance palaces, built to withstand the harsh Newport coastal weather, while looking like something transplanted from Genoa or Florence. The main floor alone contains the Great Hall, the music room, the morning room, the billiard room, the library, the dining room, each room enormous by normal standards, each decorated with materials and craftsmanship that cost fortune. The music room has walls covered in platinum leaf, actual platinum, not paint, because apparently gold wasn't impressive enough. Elaborate ceiling painting, massive windows overlooking the ocean. The dining room seats 34 people at a table custom made in France. The walls are covered in rare red marble. The ceiling is hand-painted with allegorical figures, and every single one of these rooms is decorated for Christmas. Not just one tree or a simple wreath, but elaborate, coordinated decorations that transform each space into a winter wonderland while somehow still showing off the room's architectural magnificence. This required planning that began in November, with Alice and her housekeeper determining what decorations would work in which rooms, ordering materials, coordinating with head gardeners and florists. The actual decorating took weeks and required virtually every available servant, the outdoor staff, gardeners, groundskeepers, spent days cutting evergreen branches from estate trees, gathering holly and mistletoe, creating the massive wreaths for doors and windows. These had to be fresh, which meant they couldn't be prepared too far in advance. But they also needed to be ready for Christmas, creating a narrow window for completion. Inside, housemaids and footmen worked under the housekeeper's direction to actually install the decorations. The 30-foot tree in the Great Hall required multiple strong men to maneuver into position. Getting a tree that size through doors and into place without damaging the marble floors or limestone walls or the tree itself was genuinely difficult and potentially dangerous work. Once positioned, the tree had to be secured in a massive stand, adjusted until it stood perfectly straight, crooked Christmas trees being unacceptable in a Vanderbilt household, cleaned of any damaged branches or needles. Then came the decorating, hundreds of ornaments, many of them expensive glass pieces imported from Germany, each one carefully hung by servants working from ladders. Ribbons were tied in elaborate bows, tinsel was draped artistically, strings of cranberries and popcorn. Yes, even in a mansion this expensive, these traditional decorations were arranged. And candles, real candles in special clips attached to branches, positioned carefully to create beautiful light without setting the tree on fire, a genuine concern that required vigilance throughout the holiday. The other rooms received similar attention, but scaled to their specific purposes and aesthetics. The music room, with its platinum walls and artistic pretensions, got a more refined treatment, elegant arrangements of white roses and evergreen, crystal ornaments that complemented the room's sophisticated atmosphere, decorations that enhanced, rather than overwhelmed the space's inherent beauty. The children's room, and there were several, including nurseries and playrooms and bedrooms for the Vanderbilt children, were decorated with more whimsy. Smaller trees, toys incorporated into decorations, cheerful red and green color schemes designed to delight rather than to impress. These rooms showed a warmer, more genuinely festive side of the Christmas preparations, focused on actual enjoyment rather than just display. The guest bedrooms and the breakers had many, designed to accommodate house parties exactly like this Christmas celebration. Each received decorations appropriate to their status. Your bedroom has a small tree by the window, a wreath on the door, an arrangement of evergreens and candles on the mantel. It's beautiful and welcoming, making you feel valued as a guest. But it's also clearly less elaborate than the public room, maintaining appropriate hierarchy even in decorating. The servants' quarters, located on the upper floor and in less prominent parts of the house, had minimal Christmas decoration, perhaps a wreath in the servants' dining hall, some evergreen branches in common areas, but nothing approaching the elaborate treatment of the family and guest spaces. The servants who spent weeks decorating the rest of the house had little time or energy to decorate their own spaces, and the expectation was that Christmas decorations were for the family and their guests, not for the staff who made everything possible. The logistics of maintaining these decorations throughout the holiday season were substantial. Fresh evergreens dried out and dropped needles, requiring daily sweeping and periodic replacement. Candles on the trees needed to be monitored constantly when lit. A servant was assigned specifically to watch the Great Hall tree whenever its candles were burning, ready to extinguish any that threatened to ignite branches. The hothouse flowers wilted despite the house's warmth and had to be refreshed or replaced. Water for the trees and arrangements had to be checked and refilled daily. This maintenance work was largely invisible to you as a guest. You see beautiful, perfect decorations and assume they simply stay that way, not thinking about the servants who rise early to clean up fallen needles, who replace drooping flowers, who adjust ornaments that have shifted, who ensure everything looks perfect before the family and guests see it each day. The cost of these decorations was never publicly discussed, but was certainly substantial. The evergreens themselves weren't expensive if cut from estate trees, but the labor to cut and transport and install them represented significant expense in servants' time. The hothouse flowers, roses and orchids and lilies in December, cost fortunes, potentially hundreds of dollars for the quantities used throughout the house. The imported ornaments, the hundreds of candles, the replacement decorations as things broke or wore out, all of this added up to expenditures that would have shocked most Americans, but that the Vanderbilts could afford without noticing the cost. Modern comparison. Imagine influencers who hire professional decorators to create Instagram-worthy Christmas displays, spending thousands on decorations and installation and styling, creating beautiful spaces primarily for social media content and guest impressions. The Vanderbilts were doing this at scale that made modern influencers look modest, spending equivalent amounts on every single room, creating displays that would be photographed and discussed and admired not on Instagram, but in society columns and private conversations among the wealthy elite who competed over whose Christmas was most spectacular. The religious aspect of Christmas at the Breakers was present but secondary to the social and celebratory elements. Christmas morning began with church. Trinity Church in Newport, the Episcopal church where wealthy summer residents attended when in Newport. The Vanderbilts, like most of their social class, were nominally Episcopalian, attending church as part of their social obligations and cultural identity, rather than from deep theological conviction. On Christmas morning, the family and their guests attended the Christmas service. This was expected, proper, part of how respectable wealthy people celebrated the holiday. You dressed in your finest morning attire, not quite as formal as evening wear, but still elegant and expensive, rode to the church in the Vanderbilt carriages, sat in the family's pew, prominent naturally, reflecting their social and financial position in the community. The service was traditional Episcopal liturgy, scripture readings about Christ's birth, carols sung by a choir, a sermon from the rector who was conscious that his congregation included some of the wealthiest people in America and who pitched his message accordingly. The service lasted perhaps 90 minutes, and you participated with appropriate reverence and attention, singing carols, reciting prayers, listening to the sermon with the part of your mind not distracted by admiring other parishioners' clothing or thinking about the elaborate breakfast. The church was beautifully decorated for Christmas. Evergreen garlands, poinsettias, candles, similar to the Breakers' decorations, but in service of actual religious celebration rather than social display. The Vanderbilts had contributed substantially to the church. They contributed substantially to most Newport institutions, their wealth supporting everything from churches to hospitals to cultural organizations, and this was acknowledged quietly through their prominent seating and the rector's deferential attention. After the service came the social portion, greeting other prominent families, wishing Merry Christmas to acquaintances, being seen attending church, which was important for maintaining respectability and social standing. Religion and social performance were thoroughly intertwined, church attendance being as much about demonstrating proper behavior and maintaining community position as about spiritual devotion. Back at the Breakers, the religious element of Christmas largely ended. The rest of the day was devoted to secular celebration, gift-giving, elaborate meals, entertainment, family time. Grace was said before the Christmas dinner, a brief acknowledgement of divine blessing, but it was perfunctory rather than deeply felt, a tradition maintained more from habit than conviction. This balance, or imbalance, between the religious and secular aspects of Christmas was typical of wealthy Gilded Age families. They attended church, they acknowledged the Christian origins of the holiday, they maintained the outward forms of religious observance, but their actual celebration was focused on material abundance, social performance, family tradition, and the display of wealth and taste, rather than on spiritual reflection or religious devotion. For the Vanderbilt children, this created a somewhat confusing message about what Christmas actually meant. They attended church and heard about Christ's birth, about the spiritual significance of the holiday, about giving and humility and love. Then they returned to the breakers to receive gifts worth more than most families earned in years, to participate in celebrations centered on material excess, to live in luxury that contradicted many of the spiritual messages they'd just heard in church. Some children absorbed this contradiction and became troubled by it as adults, questioning the excess they'd grown up with, and sometimes rejecting it or seeking more meaningful spiritual lives. Others simply accepted it as normal, that wealthy families attended church and also lived in palaces and received extravagant gifts, that there was no real conflict between Christian teachings and Gilded Age excess, because their wealth was evidence of God's favor, and they used it generously, if selectively, for charitable purposes. The children's experience of Christmas at the breakers was genuinely complicated, mixing magical elements with aspects that were overwhelming or confusing, or that created unrealistic expectations. The Vanderbilt children, and they had 7, though not all survived to adulthood, and not all would have been present for every Christmas, ranged in age from infants to teenagers during the breakers era. For the younger children, Christmas at the breakers must have been genuinely wonderful in many ways. They woke up in beautiful rooms in a palace by the sea. They had Christmas stockings filled with expensive toys and treats. They had a massive Christmas tree to admire and presents beyond what most children could imagine. They had loving parents. By accounts, Cornelius and Alice were genuinely devoted to their children, despite the formality of their public lives. And extended family and celebrations focused partly on their happiness. But the experience was also shaped by wealth and formality in ways that made it different from the cozy family Christmases that existed in popular imagination. The children didn't run freely through the house on Christmas morning. They had to dress properly first, had to wait for appropriate times, had to behave with decorum suitable to their position. They opened presents in the morning room or the library, supervised by parents and governesses, expected to express appropriate gratitude for each gift, to maintain good manners even when excited. The gifts themselves were extraordinary, but also potentially overwhelming. These weren't simple toys, but elaborate, expensive items. Dolls from Paris with extensive wardrobes, miniature carriages pulled by mechanical horses, full-sized ponies, actually ponies costing hundreds of dollars, elaborate train sets, expensive books, clothing that cost more than working families' entire Christmas budgets. For very young children, this abundance might have been genuinely delightful, but for older children, it created complications around appreciation and understanding value. How do you teach children to appreciate gifts when they receive so many that they literally cannot play with them all? How do you help them understand that most children don't have that their life is extraordinarily unusual without making them feel guilty or strange? The Vanderbilt parents presumably tried to navigate these questions, teaching their children about gratitude and charity and their responsibilities that came with wealth, but it was genuinely difficult to raise. Children normally, when they're normal, was a 70-room palazzo with dozens of servants. The children also experienced Christmas differently because they were simultaneously central to it and separate from it. Christmas morning was focused on them, their gifts, their excitement, their happiness. But Christmas dinner and the evening entertainment were adult affairs that they participated in only briefly, if at all. They might join the family for part of Christmas dinner, but then return to the nursery while adults continued celebrating. They were dressed up and brought down to see guests, admired and complimented, then returned to their own spaces while the real party continued without them. This created a strange dynamic where Christmas was supposedly for children, but was actually primarily for adults, with children as props in an elaborate social performance. The massive Christmas tree in the Great Hall was impressive to children, but was really there to impress adult guests. The extensive decorations delighted children, but were designed to demonstrate wealth and taste to other adults. Even many of the children's gifts were chosen as much for how they reflected on the parents' generosity and sophistication as for what the children actually wanted. For the Vanderbilt children growing up in this environment, Christmas probably felt magical and special, while also being somewhat confusing and overwhelming. They had every material advantage, but also lived under constant expectations about behavior and performance. They received extraordinary gifts, but also were expected to appreciate them appropriately and to understand that their privilege came with responsibilities. They celebrated in a palace, but with formality and structure that prevented the kind of casual family warmth that many people associate with ideal Christmases. As guests, you observe the children during brief appearances, and they seem perfectly charming, well-dressed, well-behaved, appropriately excited about Christmas. But you also notice the governess always nearby, the subtle corrections when a child gets too loud or excited, the way they're ushered away when adult conversation becomes too sophisticated, or when their presence is no longer needed for the performance of family Christmas. You wonder, watching them, whether they understand how unusual their lives are, whether they appreciate what they have, or simply take it for granted, whether growing up with this level of wealth and privilege will help or harm them as they become adults. From your perspective as a guest, they seem fortunate beyond measure, but you also sense that there's something slightly sad about childhood spent in such formality, with such wealth, that it becomes impossible to distinguish between genuine happiness and performed contentment. The performance aspect of Christmas at the Breakers becomes increasingly clear as you spend more time there. Almost everything about the celebration seems designed not just for the family's enjoyment, but for observation and admiration by others. The decorations are spectacular, partly because Alice Vanderbilt appreciates beauty, but mostly because they demonstrate the family's wealth and taste to guests who will discuss them for months afterward. The Christmas dinner is elaborate partly because the Vanderbilts enjoy good food, but mostly because hosting an impressive dinner is how you maintain social position and demonstrate appropriate generosity. Even the religious observance, attending church on Christmas morning, is as much about being seen as respectable, generous community members as about actual spiritual devotion. The Vanderbilts' substantial contributions to Trinity Church are acknowledged publicly, their prominent seating and social status reinforced by religious participation that's more social than theological. You notice this performance element particularly during Christmas dinner on Christmas Day. A formal meal with 30 guests seated at the massive dining table, served by footmen in full livery, course after elaborate course presented with ceremony and precision. The conversation is carefully pleasant. People discuss neutral topics, compliment the food and the decorations, share amusing anecdotes that entertain without causing controversy. Nobody discusses anything too serious or challenging because this is performance, not genuine intimate conversation. Alice Vanderbilt moves through the dinner with practiced grace, ensuring every guest feels attended to, that conversation flows smoothly, that the entire event proceeds with the elegant ease that appears effortless, but that actually requires substantial planning and management. She's performing the role of gracious hostess, and she's excellent at it, but it is a role. There's a distance between her public performance and any private self that might exist beneath it. The guests are performing too. You're all playing parts in this elaborate social theatre, demonstrating appropriate sophistication, showing that you belong in this exalted company, maintaining the careful standards of behaviour that define your social class. The performance is so normalised that you probably don't think of it as performance, but that's what it is. Everyone pretending that this level of wealth and formality is natural and appropriate, that celebrating Christmas with 30-course dinners served on gold-rimmed china is just how respectable people live. Modern comparison. It's like influencers staging perfect holiday content, the beautiful decorations, the coordinated outfits, the elaborately presented meals, all designed for an audience, followers on Instagram, their society columns and private gossip networks in 1898. Except the Vanderbilts were doing this at even greater scale and expense, creating performances that lasted days rather than hours, that involved dozens of people rather than just a few carefully positioned family members, that cost fortunes rather than thousands. The servants' experience of Christmas at the Breakers was dramatically different from yours as a guest or from the Vanderbilt family's experience. For the approximately 40 servants working at the Breakers during the Christmas season, the staff varied in size but was substantial. The holiday meant weeks of extra work with minimal personal celebration. They started preparing in November, the housekeeper coordinating with Alice about decorating plans, the butler managing wine and service preparations, the cook planning elaborate menus and ordering special ingredients. The actual decorating occupied much of December, with gardeners and housemaids and footmen working long hours installing evergreens and arranging flowers and hanging ornaments. During the actual holiday, servants worked harder than usual. Christmas Eve dinner required hours of preparation and service, then cleanup that extended past midnight. Christmas Day began early for kitchen staff preparing breakfast, continued through serving multiple meals, and ended late after Christmas dinner was cleared and cleaned. The servants who made Christmas magical for the family and guests worked 18-hour days while the people they served celebrated and relaxed. The Vanderbilts did provide gifts for their servants. This was expected of wealthy employers and was considered generous employment practice. Each servant received a cash bonus, typically equivalent to a week or two of wages, and sometimes small practical gifts like fabric for clothing or household items. For servants earning modest wages, perhaps $20, $40 per month depending on position and experience, these bonuses were genuinely appreciated and financially helpful. The family also allowed servants a few hours on Christmas Day for their own modest celebration. Servants gathered in their dining hall below stairs for a special meal, simpler than what the family ate, but better than ordinary servant meal, perhaps including some leftovers or similar dishes from the family's celebration. Exchanged small gifts among themselves, had a brief respite from work before returning to afternoon and evening. But the fundamental reality was that servants' Christmas was defined by serving others' celebration rather than having their own. They made the Breakers beautiful and prepared elaborate meals and maintained perfect service while having limited time for their own families. Most lived in seeing their own relatives rarely or their own celebration. The inequality was stark, the family and guests enjoying days of leisure and abundance while the people making it possible worked constantly for modest wages and brief acknowledgements of their labor. Some servants genuinely appreciated their employment. Working for the Vanderbilts was prestigious. The wages were competitive for domestic service. The working conditions were probably better than in many households. But others likely resented the inequality, felt used and undervalued, dreamed of leaving service for better opportunities. The Vanderbilts probably thought they were generous employers, and by the standards of their time and class they were. But generosity within a fundamentally exploitative system is still exploitation. By the time you leave the Breakers on the day after Christmas, you've experienced something genuinely extraordinary. 2 days in one of America's most spectacular homes, celebrated with wealth and elegance beyond what most people could imagine, hosted with graciousness and attention to every detail. You've been well fed, beautifully housed, entertained elaborately, treated as an honored guest in a palace by the sea. You've also observed some things that complicate the magic, the performance aspect that makes everything feel slightly less genuine, the way the children are simultaneously central and peripheral to celebrations designed to impress adults, the servants working constantly while you celebrate, the religious elements that seem perfunctory rather than meaningful, the sense that all this elaborate celebration is as much about display as about actual joy or spiritual significance. As your carriage pulls away from the Breakers and you look back at the magnificent palazzo, the ocean crashing behind it, You feel genuinely grateful for the experience. You've seen and experienced something remarkable, something that few people will ever see. A Christmas celebration at the absolute pinnacle of Gilded Age wealth and sophistication. But you also feel slightly relieved to be returning to your own smaller, simpler world. There was something exhausting about the breakers at Christmas, the scale of it, the formality, the constant performance, the awareness that everything was being observed and judged. For 2 days it was magical, but you're not sure you'd want to live that way permanently, in a 70-room mansion where nothing is simple or casual, where every meal requires footmen and every moment requires appropriate dress and The Vanderbilt children will grow up in this environment, and you wonder how it will shape them, whether they'll appreciate the extraordinary privilege of their lives or take it for granted, whether they'll be crushed by expectations or will flourish despite them, whether the wealth and formality and constant performance will help or harm them as they become adults and have to navigate a world that's already changing in ways their parents don't fully anticipate. The breakers itself will outlast the Gilded Age that created it. The mansion stands today, preserved as a museum, one of Newport's most visited attractions. Modern tourists walk through the same rooms you walked through as a Christmas guest in 1898, admiring the architecture and the craftsmanship and trying to imagine what it was like to actually live there. Most visitors probably imagine it was wonderful, living in such beauty, with such wealth, celebrating Christmas with such abundance and elegance, and it was wonderful in many ways, genuinely magical and spectacular and privileged beyond measure. But it was also complicated. The performance, the formality, the inequality, the children growing up in luxury that was impossible to appreciate normally, the servants working to create magic they barely participated in, the religious elements reduced to social performance. The sense that all this elaborate celebration was as much about demonstrating wealth to others as about genuine holiday joy. Christmas at the Breakers in a 70-room mansion was spectacular and overwhelming and beautiful and strange and generous and exploitative and magical and exhausting, often simultaneously. It represented the absolute peak of Gilded Age Christmas celebration. The most elaborate decorations, the finest foods, the most expensive gifts, the most prestigious guests, all displayed in one of America's most magnificent private residences. It was also fundamentally unsustainable. This level of wealth and celebration and inequality couldn't continue indefinitely, would be undermined by taxes and social changes and world wars that would make such elaborate private establishments difficult or impossible to maintain. The Breakers at Christmas in 1898 was the apex of something already beginning to decline, though the people celebrating there couldn't see it yet. For you as a guest, it was a memorable experience that you'll discuss for years. The time you spent Christmas at the Breakers, saw the spectacular decorations, dined with the Vanderbilts, experienced wealth and elegance at levels most people never witnessed. You'll remember it fondly, while also recognizing its complications, appreciating the privilege of the experience, while understanding that what looked like pure magic from the outside was more complex when you actually lived inside it for 2 days. The Breakers at Christmas was extraordinary, and you were fortunate to experience it. But you're also glad it's not your everyday life, glad to return to a world where Christmas can be simpler and more genuine, where you don't need 70 rooms and 40 servants to celebrate properly, where the holiday can be about family and tradition and faith rather than about performance and display and demonstrating wealth to others.